We have solved quadratic equations different ways, right? We've solved using the square root method. We've solved by factoring, and then we just finished solving by completing the square. We're going to go through and solve it the last way, or using our last method, which is using the quadratic formula. You guys have seen this before, so hopefully this at least seems familiar to you. The quadratic formula, if you have the equation what's called standard form, make sure this is in your notes. This is what I mean by standard form. So if you have in that form of the ax squared, the x squared's first, plus bx plus c equals 0, if you have it in that form, then there's a formula. We can take the a, b, and c, those coefficients. Remember coefficients, we defined those earlier in the class, saying that they're the numbers in front of the variables. We could take the coefficients a and b and the constant c, and we could take those three numbers and plug them into the quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula looks like this. X is equal to, and you take whatever the middle, the b, negative b, you take the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root, all over 2 times a. The inside of the square root is usually the part we have the biggest hiccups with, the most problems, the biggest pitfall. It's b squared minus 4ac. So as we go through and talk about these, we'll talk about some strategies to make sure we get that part right, the b squared minus 4ac. But anyway, we take those three numbers, just the numbers, do not include the x's, just the a, the b, and the c. We plug them into that formula, and that gives us our answer, which is nice. Most of us really like formulas, like they're easy to plug things into. The catch to it usually is the simplifying afterwards. That's usually the most difficult problem with the quadratic formula. Let's do some examples. Just as a quick reminder, before you use the quadratic formula, you got to make sure the equation's in standard form. So make sure it's the ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. If it's not in that form, then your a, b, and c, you won't get the correct a, b, and c as you go through and do that. Okay, let's try this one right here. It says, what are the solutions of x squared minus 8 equals 2x? And it wants us to use the quadratic formula. So first of all, make sure this is in standard form. So make sure it looks like we just talked about, the ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So when I look at that problem, it is not in standard form. I've got x squared minus 8 equals 2x. I want it equal to 0, so I'm going to move this 2x over. When we move it over, we have to subtract it from both sides. So I end up with x squared, and I'm going to put the 2x, now a minus 2x because we subtracted it, in the middle there. So I just move that 2x over and I put it in the middle because x squared x constant equals 0. Okay, now it's in standard form. Identify a, b, and c. There's nothing in front of the x squared, and so we can put a 1 there. So a is 1, that's a. B is a minus 2. And c is a minus 8. So there's my a, b, and c. Okay, take the a, b, and c and plug it in our formula. Here's our formula. Negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So b is already a negative 2. So when I plug it in the formula, it's a negative b. So that's a negative 2. All it does is it does the opposite of b. So it's a positive 2, plus or minus. I would suggest just leaving that square root blank for now. We'll come back to it. We go 2 times a. That's 2 times 1, which is 2. Like I talked about before, this is where we make most of our mistakes. I've found over the years teaching this that if we do that part separately, we make less mistakes. So I'm just going to do the b squared minus 4ac off to the side. So I'm doing this part right there. I'll just do it off the side here. So b is a negative 2. So it's negative 2 squared minus 4 times a times c. So you got to be really careful with signs here and the order we do things in. Always start by squaring the b. When you square the b, it's going to be a positive. Negative 2 squared is a positive 4 minus 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times a negative 8 is a negative 32. Well, minus a negative changes to plus. So I end up with 4 plus 32, which is 36. But you can see with all those negatives in there, it's easy to make a mistake. Okay, that's my answer, but I need to simplify it. So that's our next step. So I have 2 plus or minus The square root of 36 is just 6 over 2. So now I have 2 plus 6 divided by 2, and I have 2 minus 6 divided by 2. 2 plus 6 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. So there's one of my answers is 4. 2 minus 6 is a negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is a negative 2. Okay, there's my two solutions. So you'll see again that two places you got to be careful. The first part is when you find this number, that b squared minus 4ac. And a lot of times if we do it off to the side, we can avoid some of those mistakes. Another option too is if you want to, instead of working this out by hand, you can plug that whole thing in your calculator as it is, and you'll get your answer. If you're going to do that, a couple of things to be careful with. The negative, you have to put the negative 2 in parentheses before you square it. If you don't, you're going to get the wrong answer. So just be careful with that. The other one is, make sure you use a minus sign. The calculator, at least the ones we use in class, the 84s, they have a different minus and negative side. So for the minus sign, make sure you use the minus sign. And for the negative 8, make sure you use the negative sign. Those are the two pitfalls if you're using the calculator. We'll do some more practice here. So let's do this one. What are the solutions to x squared minus 4x equals 21? Again, we're using the quadratic formula. Okay, so let's make sure it's in standard form. That 21 needs to be moved over. We want it equal to 0, so it's going to be x squared minus 4x. Because it's a positive 21, I have to subtract 21 from both sides. So I end up with a minus 21 equals 0. Decide what your a, b, and c are. A is 1, b is a negative 4, and c is a negative 21. Okay, we're going to take those three numbers and plug them all in the quadratic formula. So it's going to be x equals a negative b. B is already a negative 4, so it changes it to a positive 4. Plus or minus square root. I'm going to leave that blank for a second. On the bottom, I have 2 times 1. Okay, let's figure out that b squared minus 4ac. So let's do that off to the side. So I take b and square it, minus 4 times a times c. Okay, so option number 1 is you plug that whole thing in your calculator just as it is, making sure the negative 4 is in parentheses. Option number 2 is you work it out by hand. So negative 4 squared, negative 4 times negative 4 is a positive 16, minus 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times a negative 21 is a negative 84. When you minus a negative, it changes to a plus. You add those together, we get 100 right there. Keep simplifying. It'd be 4 plus or minus square root of 100 is 10. And now I've got to find my two answers. I go 4 plus 10 divided by 2, and 4 minus 10 divided by 2. 4 plus 10 is 14, divided by 2 is 7. 4 minus 10 is a negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is a negative 3. There's my two solutions. Let's try, I want to try a different one where our solution does not come out evenly. So let's do this one right here. So it says use the quadratic formula to solve that equation, round to the nearest hundredth. We're not going to do that. To round to the nearest hundredth means if your square root doesn't come out evenly, right, it's an irrational number. We have to round it off. We're going to find exact answers. We can always plug it in a calculator afterwards if we want to. So we want to find the exact answer. Okay, let's put it in standard form. So 2x squared minus 16x, I need to move that 25 over. Because it's a minus 25, I'm going to add 25 to both sides. So we end up with a plus 25 once it's moved over. Okay, find a, b, and c. A is 2, b is negative 16, and c is 25. Okay, plug things in our formula. X is equal to negative b. It's already negative, so it changes to a positive. Plus or minus, I'm going to leave that square root blank. 2 times 2. Okay, let's figure out that b squared minus 4ac. Negative 16 squared minus 4 times a is 2 times c is 25. Now again, you can plug that all in a calculator. Just a reminder, if you do, you've got to put the negative 16 in parentheses. If you don't, here's what happens. If you plug this in a calculator, in parentheses, right? That means it's negative 16 times negative 16. It comes out to be 256. If you plug this in the calculator like that without the parentheses, then what it does is it does the 16 squared first and adds the negative after. So it gives you negative 256. Well, we want to square the negative. We need this. So if you're going to use the calculator, make sure you plug it in as negative 16 squared. Okay, so anyway, 256 is what that comes out to be. Minus 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 25, I think, is 200. And then you're going to just subtract those two. So let's see. 256 minus 200 is 56. Okay, this one's a little bit different than the previous two examples. In the previous two examples, the square root was a perfect square. It came out evenly. Square root of 56 does not. If you plug that in a calculator, you get a decimal. What we're going to do then is instead of plugging it in a calculator and getting a decimal, we're just going to take it and reduce it like we have before. So take 56, and let's do our factoring tree. So we have 7 and 8. 8 is 2 and 4. 2 and 2. So I've got 2 squared on the inside, so that'll give me a 2 on the outside, and I have the 2 and 7 left over, so it'll be a 14 on the inside. So I end up with this, 16 plus or minus 2 square root of 14 over 4. That's what x is equal to. So what that really means is I have two answers. There's one. Now, we want to make sure our answer is simplified. I can't do anything with the square root of 14, but if you do have a number on the outside right here, and there's a common factor between this one and this one and this one, you can take it out of all of them. So on top, you can take a 2 out of the top, out of the 16 and 2, and then you take it, so it looks like this. So take a 2 out of that would be 8, a 2 out of that would be 1, and a 2 out of that would be 2. So I end up with 8 plus the square root of 14 over 2. Same thing over here, you can take a 2 out of all of those. So 8, 1, and 2. So you end up with 8 minus the square root of 14 over 2. So there's my two answers. I'm okay if you want to just leave it like this, but take the 2 out. So if you write it as being 8 plus or minus the square root of 14 over 2, this would be okay too. But down here I wrote it separately. That's two separate answers. I'm okay if you write it as a single answer if you want to put that plus or minus in there. I'll accept either one. Either one is great. Now, if I did want to, the original question said round to the nearest tenth. If we wanted to, we could go back. If you want to get into decimal, you could go 8 plus the square root of 14, and that would be some decimal, and divide it by 2. You could change it to a decimal if you wanted to, but in general, unless you're told to specifically, I want you to give the exact answer. Let's do one more example here. So I have this one. I have 8a squared equals 12a minus 1. Okay, so first put it in standard form. So we're going to minus the 12a over. So 8a squared minus 12a. There's a minus 1. Move it over. So it becomes a plus 1. It's always easier to use the quadratic formula when that first term is positive. So if the 8a squared is positive, leave it there, and we're going to move those two over. If it was a negative 8a squared, then I would move it over to the other side to make it positive. So it's always easier if that a term is positive. So that's a, that's b, and that's c. Let's plug it in the formula. So I'm going to go x equals, it's already a negative 12, so it changes to positive 12, plus or minus the square root of something. 2 times 8 would be 16 down there. Okay, let's do this. Let's do the square root there. It's the b squared minus 4ac. So that would be negative 12 squared minus 4 times 8 times 1. Negative 12 squared is 144. Minus 4 times 8 is 32. Times 1 is 32. Subtract those, and that's what, 112? So that's my answers, but I want to simplify it. So let's take 112 and see if we can break it apart. I'm pretty sure it does. 2 will go into it, right? So that'd be 2 and 56. We just did 56. 56 was 7 and 8. 8 was 2 and 4. 2 and 2. So I've got a pair of 2's there, and I have a pair of 2's there. Hey, before I break that up, one thing I just thought about here is just be careful. You cannot take a common factor out of the top and the bottom if this is still inside of the square root. So this part right here, that part has to simplify before I can take out a common factor, before I can simplify it. Okay, but I have a 2 on the outside, a 2 on the outside, that'd give me a 4 and a 7 on the inside. So I have 12 plus or minus 4 square roots of 7, all over 16. And now I'll look for your common factor. So now that the 4 is on the outside, we can take a 4 out of there, a 4 out of there, and a 4 out of there. So 12 divided by 4 is 3. Divide that by 4 would be 1. 16 divided by 4 would be 4. So I end up with 3 plus or minus 1 squared is 7, which is just the square root of 7 over 4. That's as far as I can go without changing it to a decimal, without taking the square root of 7. So I'm going to leave it like that. Again, just remember that's two different answers. I'm okay if you leave it like that, but just make sure you know that really means this, right? That means that's one answer, and my other answer would be that one, 3 minus the square root of 7 over 4. Okay, so that's the quadratic formula. The nice thing about the quadratic formula, completing the square works really nice on some problems. You can actually use it on every problem, but on some problems it gets really difficult. The quadratic formula works on every problem, and it's pretty much the same. Doesn't matter, you know, if it comes out evenly or not. The process is still the same. Whereas completing the square can get kind of a little bit hairy at times. Remember, factoring doesn't always work. That's why we can't always do it that way. And the square root method doesn't always work, and that's why we can't always do it that way. So a quadratic formula, the nice thing is it always works. Sometimes it's not the fastest or the easiest way, but it will work on every single problem. All right, thanks, guys.